Okay, does Dennis know? My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome everyone here today for Saturday's dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche. This is the 21st of September, and the United Nations is now opening for its annual session. Heads of state will speak at the United Nations, and prior to the opening of that session, what has been occurring in New York City is a particular form of mobilization being done by the bankers of the City of London and also Wall Street. Now, this is a mobilization which is being done in order to thwart the continuing success, in fact, increasing success of the alliance that is presently active among the nations of Russia, India, and China. But more importantly, it's actually intended to thwart the impending and certainly more than possible alliance between the United States, led by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and these three nations, Russia, China, and India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be speaking in Houston, Texas tomorrow, and President Donald Trump will be there. And some, I think, know about the recent lunar mission that was carried out by the nation of India, which is an extraordinary both scientific and engineering feat. I had been saying, I think 2 weeks ago, that this was a very important scientific success, but there was an engineering failure. I was actually corrected by a former member of the Trump administration who was in the sciences who pointed out, no, actually it was an engineering success until the last minute. And it should be thought about that way, because that's the nature of science. It's the nature also of a kind of dialogue among scientists that is going on. And I think there's no better place for those two individuals to meet than Houston. There have been recent discussions in Houston about John F. Kennedy's Rice University speech, at which he first announced the moon mission back in 1961-62. But what I think is also important is to think for a minute about the nation of India from the standpoint of the United States. Think about the nation of India from the standpoint of the United States presidency. And think about both of them over the arc of the next 50 years. The reason that it's relevant to do that is there are some things to recognize about why the sideshow that happened yesterday on the streets of America, but also throughout Europe, in which there were as many as 4 million plus people involved, most of them young, in advocating that something be done about what they call climate change or global warming, which is an apocryphal task. It's not something about which you could do anything if it were true. And it happens to not be true, but in the way in which it has been posed, there's nothing efficient that can be done. The more honest among the radical environmentalists who have become, shall we say, extreme pessimists, admit that from their standpoint, that is from the most pessimistic of the environmentalists, their point is that you're going to have a 2 to 3 degree rise in temperatures anyway, and you may have as much as 8 degrees rise no matter what anybody does. So the people who are prepared to be the most radically wrong admit that there's no possible way that their wrong view can result in anything except human extinction, or perhaps, as they say, the planet boiling over. I don't really know why it is that these people never think to ask simple questions like, what was the average temperature on Earth 100,000 years ago? Because you'll find it was about 77 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Or if you go back to the time of the dinosaurs, of the fifth extinction, as it's called, 65 million years ago, you'll find that the world was about 100 degrees warmer. Somehow it didn't boil over. But be that as it may, why quibble with insanity? It doesn't really do much, because that's not really why the people are caused to take this view. That doesn't mean, though, that 4.5 million people had that view. A lot of people were put out there on those streets, and they have no idea about what they are actually confronted with. They are confronted with something. And so back to India for a minute. if you look at population projections over the period between now and approximately the year 2050 to 2060, you'll see that India will become the world's largest country. And that'll happen by approximately 2024. And its growth won't slow down probably until about 2060. It's going to overtake China. And what's going to happen is there'll be over 1.6 billion people in India. China's population, presently as projected, is actually going to decline by 400 million, from 1.4 billion to about 1 billion. What might interest you is to know that as of right now, the population of Russia, one of the largest territories on the face of the earth, which is about 150 million, is projected to go down to about 132 million. The United States is projected to have about 400 million people by that time, but it will no longer be the third largest nation. That honor will go to Nigeria. Nigeria will be about 800 million people. And consequently, the question of the relationship between India, China, the United States, and Russia with respect to Africa is the primary actual question of physical economy in the world today. Now, that question, however, can't be approached from 20th century views of technology. It can only be approached efficiently from the standpoint of 22nd century views of technology. That is to say, the development of thermonuclear fusion power as an actual power and energy source for the world, and the derivative energy sources such as nuclear fission, and for that matter, the then evolving out of use of coal and oil. However, let me say something very clearly here. The crash programs that we propose in terms of what should be done over the next 15 to 20 years may very well require the increase of the use of oil and gas and coal, which has no problem whatsoever, precisely because the commitment is to go to a higher economic platform with an energy source in transition from nuclear fission power to fission-fusion hybrids and then to fusion power. In order to make that happen as rapidly as it might happen, it's precisely the space program that will be the incentive to cause those technologies to come online as rapidly as possible. And so therefore, it's our view, as we've said often here, that the world both needs more people, is not overpopulated, and does not face the form of crisis that has been proposed. There is a crisis, however. And that crisis is that the world has too many crooked bankers. It has too many degenerate oligarchs, and it has too many manipulated fools. And the population of all three of those should be reduced. What we're going to be doing in the next days and weeks is something we already began to pioneer over the last 2 weeks. We refer to it as the Days of Action. And that campaign that we initiated was led by two individuals, both of whom you're going to be hearing speak today. And the first is Daniel Burke, who is a candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of New Jersey, and who has played the primary role as the spokesperson for the Days of Action over the past couple of weeks, especially as that pertains to building a new form of youth movement, if you will, in the United States for economic progress. Daniel?
Ooh. Thank you, Dennis. So yes, I'm Daniel Burke. I am a candidate for U.S. Senate in New Jersey, endorsed by the Lyndon LaRouche Political Action Committee. And I want to say again, as I said last week, we've succeeded in our weeks of action in catalyzing something which has a potential to shift world history. As to whether it succeeds depends on what we do, and critically, in the coming weeks. We should be honest with ourselves. that we're facing something which is the growth of a fascist movement across the world, an international green fascist movement, which is quite terrifying in that you have millions upon millions of young people directly engaged, which affects thereby hundreds of millions of young people. It's targeting the youngest in our country and across the world, literally pre-adolescents, and it wants to use an induced pessimism as a battering ram against any humanistic, optimistic policies breaking out, the kind of policies that would create a new, just world economic system as Lyndon LaRouche fought his entire life to achieve. So let's stand against this in truth and call it what it is, that the policies being promoted by the Extinction Rebellion, being promoted by Mark Carney at the Bank of England, being promoted by these green fascist organizations, is 100 times worse than Hitler. And we have to be able to stand up and represent that fact, and yet do it with a deep optimism about solving it, with a profound and honest optimism about overcoming this, with an insight into the true nature of the universe. Lyndon LaRouche famously said, "Our power is their reason." And this is the concept upon which our entire hope for humanity depends. That there is a universal power of creative reason in every individual, and that it exists in the youth. That we can call upon this quality, that we can summon it up, a spirit that will come forward in a way that is inexplicable even to those people in whom it appears. And that spirit of optimism, that devotion to something truly human, can be marshaled today to break out of the present situation, to cause something new to come forward. So I think about young Nicholas of Cusa. If you imagine what Italy was like in the 1400s. At the height of the Roman Empire, there were, about 100 AD, there were 1 million citizens in Rome, 1 million people who lived in Rome. Today, I think there's around 3 million. So you're talking about an enormous ancient city. By the 1400s, there were less than 50,000 people living in that city. Mass depopulation took place over a long period of time because of this anti-human, satanic Roman Empire and the axioms that were at the heart of it. And you have to imagine that our young hero, Nicholas of Cusa, is, regarding that situation. If you were to visit Rome, you walk through and the whole thing would be ruins. It would just be, everywhere you would go would be ruins. And in order to break out of this dark age and create a new humanity, he dug deep into the sub-basements and pulled up the Plato dialogues, the dialogues of Plato, and translated them and gave them to the youth from this standpoint of a creation of a new humanity, of a new paradigm. And there's so much more that can be said about his heroism and the people who worked with him to overcome the conditions that they found themselves in. But I think about him because I refuse to accept the idea that because things are so challenging and so desperate, that therefore we have to consider ourselves somehow, we have to look at this in despair. Absolutely not. We have an opportunity here if we introduce a level of imagination, a level of a desire for the future. If we really do it from the standpoint of a new humanity, we have a potential to change everything. We have a potential to bring Lyndon LaRouche's concepts to the young people who have been barred from understanding what he did in his life, been barred from reading any of his work. We can change that personally. We have every potential to do so. What we're up against is primarily pessimism. And so we first look at that in ourselves. We find what exists within ourselves of that, and we get rid of it. We figure out how to overcome it socially. We find a true insight into the universe, and we grab onto that. Knowledge and not mere opinion, which is what this green cult is based on, the popular opinion of the masses. So what we're attempting to do, I think, in this campaign that I'm running, and that generally as this focus on the youth of the world has been taken up by our international organization, we're out to lift a beacon that can give people the hope that they need, and that can direct them to the ideas that they need, to the knowledge that they need. I'd ask everyone who participated in this over the recent weeks to consider what it means to the people of Europe, to the people of Germany, that we're fighting here, that there's a potential to break through. There's been, we really have to view ourselves from the standpoint of a international, universal, world historic basis. Every single person who's involved in what this movement is fighting for. Think about what it means to our movement in South Africa and the people to whom they're speaking, who received that horrendous, racist, evil speech from Barack Obama back in 2009, telling them that they are not allowed to have increases in their standards of living because the world will boil over. We have a tremendous, potential here to do something meaningful for others. I'll put it that way. You look at the budding opportunities across the world. Here in the United States, I'm calling on you to take a step forward, to do something you haven't done before, and to mobilize. And what I'm sincerely committed to is the idea that what we catalyzed over the past couple of weeks will be brought forward at the United Nations General Assembly. This morning, Greta Thunberg and a variety of other young climate activists, people who are being duped, who are being abused by their controllers, who are promoting these genocidal policies through them. They spoke at something called the UN Youth Climate Summit. And our people were there. We got out 750 leaflets of Helga's international call to the youth. We had a dozen people out in the street meeting the young people going into that, and sharing with them a truthful insight into the world, which has very much to do with what Dennis spoke about regarding India's space progress and the progress of all mankind towards the moon, to return to the moon and to develop from there. What we are going to do over the following week is to escalate in every opportunity that we have. There's going to be, look at all the heads of state who are coming this week. We're going there, and we're bringing them the spirit of LaRouche, and we're going to break through the controlled environment if we have the courage to devote ourselves to a truthful insight into the universe, if we have the courage to devote ourselves to their creative reason. Then I think we'll be acting in such a way that Nicholas of Cusa and Lyndon LaRouche can be proud of us. So that's my comment on this point, and I want to again invite you, join us thoroughly and provide the resources such that we can make this happen. Not only are we active in New York on this basis, but across the country, given this General Assembly, you have every potential to talk to people, to continue the organizing on the campuses, in the various places that you can talk to people, whether it's your neighbor or out at a post office, or to the state legislators or the congressman, or to call the White House. These are all things that we should be doing with this view in mind. Let's think of a new paradigm coming into being, in potential, in the coming weeks. Let's imagine what it would take for the leaders of the world to put together a new, just world economic order. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. The next speaker has been with Lyndon LaRouche as long as I can remember, since we happen to have joined the organization together from college days. But specifically, the reason that it's important for us to hear from him was not only his involvement in the Days of Action, but the fact that in South and Central America in specific, we have a very vibrant LaRouche movement, and always have had, actually, since the days of the 1970s. He's fond of pointing out something that we learned directly through Lyndon LaRouche, which is, if you want to educate a president, build a youth movement. Now, there's some people who are trying to usurp SDS style the agenda at the United Nations by showing up with a lot of people yelling and screaming in one way. But we're doing something much different. And the way that we're running it is as an international flank into not merely one part of the world, but all parts of the world and all parts of the corridors of power. This is something we learned how to do a long time ago through Lyndon LaRouche. We also learned, though, that in order to be able to do that, you also have to give people a sober picture of what they are actually up against. You have to give them a kind of a tour de horizon, that they can see the world for what it is and see how a small force armed with the proper ideas is able to not only intervene, but actually to be victorious against that otherwise doomed scenario and the denizens of that scenario, the people that find themselves doomed to go along with it. So I want to introduce now not just the director of our South American work, but also one of the co-editors of EIR, Dennis Small.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that. And let me just begin by picking up on something that Daniel was saying, which is this idea, this concept that we are facing an eco-fascist movement, that we're looking at a problem of mass fascism in the early stages that is being organized. Now, some people out there in the population, as you may have noticed, will be shocked at that idea, and they may not believe it. Maybe even some of your neighbors, maybe possibly, I doubt it, but possibly some people actually listening to this broadcast. But just in case, let's be clear. What do we mean when we talk about fascism? Let's be scientifically precise. We are not talking about a definition of fascism as people who wear swastikas. Sometimes they do. We're not talking about people who wear brown shirts. Sometimes they do. But actually, if you read through Lyndon LaRouche's writings and read history and look at how this has evolved historically, what fascism is organized pessimism. It's organized both politically and economically, which is why it becomes such a serious danger under conditions of crisis, the exact same conditions which tremendous opportunities arise from. And the reason that fascism is one of the forms of organized pessimism is that the concept of man that fascism promotes is the one and the only basis for actual pessimism. It is the idea that man is not capable of addressing problems, is not capable of coming up with solutions, is not capable of developing his economy, that the concept of man is essentially one of a beast. Sometimes a better trained beast, sometimes less trained, but the idea that oh my gosh, it's all going under. There's nothing we can do about it. And if that is in fact your starting point in the discussion and your deepest psychological belief as to who you are and what the world are, then you are already a long step on, marching along the road to fascism, even if you hate swastikas. And this is the problem that we're facing here. So when Daniel talked about the danger of a fascist movement, a lot of Americans think, well, that's something that happens over there. It's sort of like wars. They don't happen here. They happen there. And fascism doesn't happen here. It happens there. That's unfortunately not true. And the danger that we're addressing, and the topic I want to sort of keep for people to keep in the back of their minds as I go through a couple of topics of discussion here, is this issue of organized pessimism, because that is not the natural state of man. The natural state of man, as of with any child, just look at a newborn or a very, very young child, is optimism. Optimism, not that the immediate circumstances are necessarily great, but optimism over the idea that in coordination with other people, acting through institutions which we as human beings help to organize, we are capable of anything. We're capable of coming up with new ideas, with new solutions, with organizing things, doing things better. That kind of optimism about the human condition. And that's really what the fundamental political fight is all about. Now, I want to begin by just giving you a brief review of what we did accomplish over the International Days of Actions, which we set out to do. And in her recent discussions about this, Helga Zepp-LaRouche was very clear that she considered this a significant accomplishment of our movement internationally. And when I say movement, I mean not only card-carrying members, of which there are none, because we don't have cards, so we don't carry them. The only cards are up here in the concept of man. But not only direct members as such, but the broader circles of people who are organizing under the conceptual leadership that the LaRouche movement is providing. And what we did is really, I think, quite significant. If I could have the first slide, I want to show people a world map, which gives a quick bird's eye view. We essentially, over the period of September 10th through 12th, some places cheated a little bit and jumped the gun and started early. Some went a day longer. But basically in that period, we organized in 50 cities around the world, approximately, on all 7 continents, and I include Antarctica in that because we had some colleagues in Argentina who had friends who worked on scientific research bases in Antarctica, and so they effectively leafleted with Helga's International Call to Youth, that leaflet, which is what we got out elsewhere. They covered Antarctica that way, and we presented not just an optimistic approach, not just, hey, look, think positive, but an actual scientific basis based on man's ability to create and come up with solutions, in particular pointing towards space exploration and colonization with fusion-powered methods as something which transforms not only what we know, but actually how we know, and gets back to basics on that. So this was really a very significant accomplishment. One of the more fun and interesting things is that if you look to the southern tip of Africa, we actually deployed in South Africa. And if I could show people the next slide, this is a picture of one of our organizers in the middle holding leaflets, which I'm sure you're familiar with, deploying on the outskirts of Johannesburg at a shopping center, which is nicely called Mandela Square, and talking with people. We have got a series of 8 or so pictures of these. I'm just showing you one of organizing around LaRouche's ideas going on in South Africa. Now, one of the things that we've done in South America, and in a moment I'm going to show you a video on this, but I want to explain to you what this is first for a moment. Which is that we've, in a half dozen countries in South America, Ibero-America, Central America, Mexico, and so on, we're deployed not only organizing around Helga's leaflet as part of the International Days of Action, but also organizing for a major video conference, a Spanish language video conference, which will be held on September 26th in a half dozen Ibero-American countries, which will be addressed by Ben Deniston of LaRouche's scientific team on the issue of the scientific basis for combating and defeating green fascism, where he will lay out and discuss the details of the program around space and around fusion energy and so on to combat this. Now, this event will be held on the 26th of September. So what we did simultaneously with handing out Helga's leaflet is that we were also organizing with a second leaflet, which emphasized the same essential points, but urging people to participate in this Spanish language webcast or video conference. Now, one of the things which we did in Mexico in particular, and this goes back to the very origins of the LaRouche movement in Mexico, which goes back to, I guess, 1974, 75. Our organizers there, building a movement among youth, going to campuses, going to universities, developed an organizing technique which in Spanish is called salonear, which comes from the word salon, which is a classroom. So I guess you could call it classrooming. So classrooming, in the classical definition of the term, is a team of a couple of LaRouche movement organizers go classroom to classroom at a university. They request of the professor permission to address the students for a couple of minutes, or if the teacher is lazy, they'll give us a half an hour so that they don't have to teach, to brief them, to discuss what we're doing, to leaflet, to sell literature, to get contacts, and so on. And this is a long-standing tradition in Mexico. So the video I'm going to show you in a moment, it's very brief. It's only 40 seconds long, so make sure you pay attention and don't blink because it'll go by you fast. But it's a little video taken with a phone of one of our organizers in Mexico City who was in a classroom at the National Polytechnic Institute. And what is captured on this little clip is Gerardo discussing with them the issue of space and the needed coordination among the United States, Russia, other powers, and why isn't Mexico involved in this? Somewhat the idea that Dennis Speed was just discussing a moment ago. So if we are ready and have that video queued up, I'd like to show that to you.
Eso permite además facilitar que haya un ambiente de paz entre las naciones. Si Estados Unidos y Rusia colaboran en el sistema espacial, que no lo hacen, muy poco, si se afianzan esas relaciones, podemos hablar de que pueden transitar por un periodo en el cual pueden resolver sus problemas. Ahora, América Latina tiene un tremendo potencial y es lo que queremos nosotros mostrar en esta conferencia. México es un ausente completo en las ciencias del espacio. No se habla de eso en las universidades. No digan economía. Van ustedes a...
Okay, so that just gives you a quick idea of or an organizing technique that we've always used in Mexico especially, but in this immediate situation, what we were doing there. But this was part, and the only reason it was effective really, it was part of an international day of action around a single organizing thrust. And the reason this is effective is not because of the numbers. It's not that much, 50 cities, 5,000, 7,000 leaflets, and so on. That's not an effect in numbers. It's an effect in the power of ideas, because what those young students in Mexico were seeing was profound ideas discussed that were being discussed the same day, the same hour, the same way in South Africa, in the United States, in New Jersey, even Princeton University, although that was a little difficult as I understand, in Berlin, in Copenhagen, in the Philippines, across the planet. And there is an enormous power, as there always has been in the LaRouche movement, of having, as we've always said, one fist over 6 continents, or soon enough, I mean, it's really one fist over 7 continents, although we weren't actually physically on the ground in Antarctica, but we'll get there. So there's a reason that this is so powerful. Now, this activity and this organizing that that I'm referring to internationally actually comes after and is built on the shoulders of what we accomplished internationally with the memorials for Lyndon LaRouche. This is a organizing thrust which is built on the enormous power and weight of the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche and our efforts to provide a renaissance, a rebirth of those ideas through our organizing and through our activities, again, in the United States, in Europe, in Ibero-America, around LaRouche's legacy, the legacy of his living ideas, a living memorial to LaRouche. That's what this Days of Action were actually built upon. Now, let's keep that in mind, set it aside for a second, and let's consider this mass mobilization that's going on internationally, which one of our organizers characterized, I think, very usefully as greenwashing. People are having their brains washed in green, and it is a complete wash. Yesterday was the first day of a global climate strike. They mobilized a lot more people than we did. There are 4 million in Europe. There are 5 million, 6 million, 7 million internationally. That's a lot of kids. It's a lot of people out there. They mobilized in anywhere from 130 countries to 140 countries. They say that they did this in about 4,000 locations. I don't doubt the numbers. What I doubt is that reality corresponds to anything that they're saying, either in terms of what they're discussing around the climate question or in terms of the nature of their own mobilization. This is extremely dangerous, what's going on, but it's also something that they intend to impose through methods which could best be described as shock and awe, which you may recall as the British geopolitical technique, which Obama and Bush and so on attempted to use with not such great success in Iraq, in Syria, and so on and so forth. The whole idea of shock and awe, which is you don't have to actually do anything, you have to terrify people into submission. Now, take a look at this for a second. The description that we've provided, a preliminary description of our capabilities and what we've done, versus this enormous deployment that's going on around an idea which is scientifically, technically fascist. That doesn't mean that everyone who's involved in those demonstrations or use the occasion to skip school and so on and so forth are themselves fascists. But the ideas which they are being encouraged to support, and which many of them repeat, even though they may not believe them or even know what they're saying, those ideas are fascist. Now, if you consider this, I mean, we really are talking about a situation of David versus Goliath, right? Where we're David and you know, even an order of magnitude less in one sense, and they're Goliath in an order of magnitude more in one sense, trying to get their paradigm shift accomplished through shock and awe. So the question that naturally comes up, and anyone who doesn't ask him or herself this question, or doesn't admit to asking themselves this question, is really not being upfront, not telling the truth. The question is, how can we possibly defeat this? How can we win? And that, of course, is what the shock and awe method is designed to provoke, which is to induce, it's like a shock grenade, right? Where the percussive shock paralyzes people. This is meant to be a psychological percussive shock, to get people to say, oh my God, we can't do anything. Everyone thinks this. Everyone thinks this. I can't be overheard saying something against what these millions of people are saying. I'll be ostracized. No one will talk to me. My friends won't want to go out with me. No one will want to go out and smoke some dope anymore with me on the street corner. I can't say that. And that's how this thing is intended to work. And people, all of us included, rightfully question and ask, well, how can we actually stop this? And I think that the beginning of the answer lies, well, I want to talk about two aspects of this, but in particular what LaRouche always referred to as the principle of the flank. You find the enemy's weak flank, even though he may be in a frontal assault far stronger than you. I mean, if we were to try to build up by base building our demonstrations and have a bigger demonstration than what Greta Thunberg can pull together with the entirety of the international media behind her, all right, well, I would suspect that she'll get more people out in the street than we will. But so the question is, where is the vulnerability? What's the weak flank? What's the Achilles heel? How do we have to think about this? And what LaRouche always emphasized is that flanks are mental, they're conceptual. Yes, they're also military. Yes, they're physical. Yes, they become material. But the fundamental flank is in the mind of the opponent and in one's ability to outflank the way they think to find their point of vulnerability. And that's how LaRouche became as powerful as he did. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But there's two aspects to this. First of all, what can we say about what they're saying? Well, first, it's just lies. I mean, the question is the lies versus the truth. And that's comforting in one way, but we have to make sure that people actually know that, understand it, and we expose that. So one of their big vulnerabilities is very simple. They're telling lies. They're not telling the truth about anything. The second crucial issue is how the human mind works. That's really a tremendous vulnerability of theirs, and how the human mind works, especially under conditions of a financial, economic, and political breakdown crisis of society, which is what is actually happening. In other words, there's a real world out there. It's not just a question of what you say or how much you can repeat it. How much by, as Goebbels used to say, if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. Well, there's an element of truth to that, but there's a fundamental problem here, which is that that's not how the human mind works, and it is not the nature of what is actually happening in the real world, which is that we have the disintegration of an entire system, of a financial system. So we have to put these pieces together as we decide on our strategy for victory. Okay, let's first look at the question of lies versus the truth. Can I have the next slide, please? I want to show you the yeah, okay, it's there. Well, there's a history to this kind of apocalyptic fear-mongering, and it is absolutely that and nothing else. This is 1967. These are comments of Paul Ehrlich, one of the granddaddies of the Malthusian movement, one of the early organizers of the idea that the world is going to blow up or melt down or boil over or freeze or something if we don't do something. And in 1967, as published in the Los Angeles Times, Paul Ehrlich said, and got a lot of publicity internationally, saying that a dire famine was forecast by 1975. He was giving it 8 years. And he also said it's already too late. So why say it's already too late? Because you can induce a certain type of behavior if you convince people that in fact it is already too late. So, you know, just give it up and it's a disaster. So that's what he said. Next slide, please. Moving ahead 7 years, January 29th, 1974, published in The Guardian, a comment that says, space satellites show new ice age coming fast. And you thought there was global warming. There was global freezing going on back then, back in 1974. And not only was The Guardian say it, but I actually have in front of me an article in Time magazine, which is so terrifying that I did not make a slide of it because I didn't think you'd be able to face it, frankly. But I am going to read you a sentence or two of it. The Time magazine article is dated June 24th, 1974. And the headline is, Another Ice Age? Remember, this is 74, we were freezing. Now we're overheating. Okay, another ice age. And in its extensive discussion of this, there's one particularly terrifying sentence, which I am going to read you because I trust your maturity in being able to deal with this emotionally. They say, telltale signs are everywhere of the ice age, right? Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of packed ice in the waters around Iceland, to the, and as if that weren't enough, to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this absolutely terrifying. I mean, the armadillo, oh my gosh, how is it possible? It's a good thing we dealt with the ice age thanks to the warnings of these people, and now we don't have an ice age, but we have global boiling over. Next slide, please. This is a flash ahead, June 30th, 1989, published by AP, the highly respectable news agency. Rising seas could obliterate nations, say UN officials. And incidentally, I should just mention to you that around this time, there were also predictions that the entirety of the West Side Highway in New York City would be underwater by 2019. Now, that may happen, but that will be because of the lack of adequate infrastructure, not because of global flooding and rising seas and all of that. Okay, moving to the next slide, to a little more recent period. This is Al Gore, December 14th, 2009, in the Independent. We've done an about face. We're now no longer have global freezing, we have global warming. And Al Gore says the polar ice cap may disappear by the summer of 2014. Whew, that was a close call. Next slide. July 9th, 2009, in the Independent. Prince Charles, this was back in 2009 when he was optimistic. He said, just 96 months to save the world, says Prince Charles. Now, if I've got this right, 96 months is 8 years, right? 8 times 12 is 96, with me? So 8 years from July 2009 means that it was all over in 2017. Fortunately for us, Prince Charles is very flexible in his thinking, and he came up with another warning more recently, which is that we had 18 months left to survive. I think it was 18 months. Maybe it's down to 16 now. I can't quite keep up with this. So, okay, that gives you an idea, a quick bird's eye view of the history of this utter insanity and utter nonsense which passes for climate science. It has nothing to do with the facts. It has nothing to do with any evidence. It simply is a question of inducing a psychotic, terrified, pessimistic state of mind in the population. And if you can do that by first telling them it's all going to freeze, and that doesn't work, so you say, well, no, actually, I didn't mean freeze, I meant boil over. And if that doesn't work, the new instructions that have gone out to all of the media is, well, no, we're talking about a climate crisis. We're not going to talk about global warming anymore. Just say climate crisis. And so that's what's going on. Why is it going on? Because the world financial system of the people who run this show, the media show, and induce all these kids to get out there repeating things that they don't believe in any way whatsoever, but know they should be overheard saying it to remain in good standing and good stead with their peers. The global financial system is in a meltdown state. And this is something which has come to the surface over the course of this last week in a way that was not immediately evident in that form until now. Now, you may have seen the reports of this. Beginning this week, the Federal Reserve of the United States faced a crisis in the interbank market. The interbank market is sort of the real nitty-gritty of the whole financial system. It's where banks lend each other funds overnight to cover the immediate requirements of those who are most desperate. It's sort of like swapping spit, but worse. And under conditions of extreme insolvency across the board in the banking sector, what starts to happen is that this pack of thieves won't lend to each other anymore because they know it's probably not going to make it overnight. This is what happened in 2007 and 2008. The mortgage crisis was the least of it. That was just the immediate trigger. But when the interbank market grinds to a halt, then you've got really major problems. That's happening. That's happening right now this week, so much so that the Fed had to jump in because the interest rate on the interbank market was such that it was rising above the Fed rate for lending generally, which they had just dropped down to 2% or under 2% to try to get more liquidity into the system. And the lending on this interbank market was rising to 10% and above. So that was obviously not going to work. So the Fed jumped in what they call the repo market, the repurchase market, in which they essentially buy back treasuries and other things that they've issued so that the banks get hot cash into their hands to make it from Monday night to Tuesday morning. And then it comes due. Then again, Tuesday night, they do the same thing. And this is what's been going on. The Fed has been jumping into the repo market every single day this week, starting Tuesday. It's 4 days this week, to the tune of about $75 billion a day to try to put some liquidity into the market, which isn't working. And in one sense, it's a rollover from one day to the next, so you can't just sort of arithmetically add those numbers. But it's actually even much worse than arithmetically adding the numbers, because what's happening is that the length of those repos is beginning to extend from a day to a week to a month. Soon it'll be a year, and then you're back into full-fledged quantitative easing. And that even that's not going to work, because you have a situation where no possible rate of increase of the money supply internationally is sufficient to keep a $1.5 quadrillion bubble afloat. We've reached that point where it's no can do. This thing is actually blowing out. There's various expressions of this as things that have happened with Argentina, which we can discuss if you want which reflect the same thing. We can discuss that in the discussion period. But we are at a point where the long-standing, well-known bankruptcy of the system, which Lyndon LaRouche has talked about for years and provided solutions for, and which is well known to the higher elites of the banking crowd, but they don't provide solutions for it other than to promote the extension of the most profound fascist pessimism throughout the population, especially in the youth. The only way their system can be bailed out is if people actually buy into the pessimistic concept of man that is behind the global climate strike movement. That's what its danger is, and that's why they're so vulnerable, because people are not going to believe this sort of stuff forever. In fact, if you actually look at a map of the United States of where most of these strikes and protests are going on, you'll notice it's mainly on the two coasts, but in the heartland of the United States, it's far less. These are the people who voted for Trump. They voted for him because they were sick and tired of the entire system. All right, this is the Rust Belt. This is our base. This is the LaRouche base. People in both parties and in no party who can't stand this system but don't know what to do. And they want us to figure out a way to make it all better. And we can do that. It's not the way they think, but it can be done. Now, how does it work? What's LaRouche's role in this? LaRouche's role in this, I think one of the best ways to get an idea of this is that I mentioned this to some people in the past. Everybody in Ibero-America always thought that it was Senator Lyndon LaRouche. Now, you know, it's not because in Spanish, Mr. LaRouche is Señor LaRouche and Senator is Senador LaRouche. It's not because Señor and Senador sound the same. That's not why. In fact, we would tell people, no, he's not a senator. He's just a philosopher king. He's a political leader based on ideas. And they would tell us, no, he's a senator. Don't tell me he isn't. He is. Or similarly, other people who, after reading lots of LaRouche's works over the years, would tell us with absolute conviction, Lyndon LaRouche doesn't exist because he can't exist. No one person could possibly know and write about with such expertise what he has done. It's not possible. So stop bullshitting us. It's obviously a committee, and you chose the name Lyndon LaRouche. It's a funny name anyway, right? Now, what's going on here? Why would people think that you have to be a senator to wield the power that LaRouche's ideas? Because people think not on the basis of whether ideas are correct or incorrect. They think through institutions. That was the whole basis on which Bertrand Russell argued that you can and have to educate the youth and convince them that snow is black. You can't do it on the basis of scientific evidence. You can only do it on the basis of a brainwashing which depends on convincing people, creating a controlled environment, convincing them as they think through institutions, i.e. anybody who has power over you. They say this, therefore, if you want to even exist or have an identity, you have to agree with what they say. And that's how people think, is they tend to think through institutions, good or bad. Now, so the issue becomes, how do you break the controlled environment? That's the issue. It's not a question of going up one for one frontally with no flanks against this monstrosity that's being created by the bankers. Well, we won't win that way. Don't even try. The only way it works is by breaking the controlled environment, by saying the truth under conditions of a breakdown collapse. And that is what's going on. This is how all revolutions, all renaissances have occurred. What happened in the 14th century was that. It was a breakdown crisis of society in which just a handful of men and women fought with their entire lives and their commitment, stood up and said in their own way, yes, I am a candidate for Senate. They weren't necessarily candidates for Senate, but they stood up and they said, this is the truth. And they organized a movement based on scientific optimism, which defeated the cultural pessimism which had created the Black Death, and it turned into the Renaissance through people like Leonardo da Vinci and Cervantes and Shakespeare and Kepler and Cusa and so on and so forth. And that's how it works. Our goal is not to win the majority of people to our view. Our goal is to make sure that our ideas are sufficiently available and understood in depth to enough people such that when everything crashes, they know where to go and they turn to us. So we're not trying to win a beauty contest. We're not trying to get gate receipts. We're not trying to win a turnstile war. That's not why we run in elections. We're winning a war of ideas because that's what power is. Power is ideas. Lyndon LaRouche was not a senator. I hate to break it to you. He was not a senator. But he did meet with heads of state, heads of government, as did Helga throughout his entire life. And along both Lynn and Helga and a couple of top representatives of his, people like Jacques Cheminade and so on, not only had influence throughout society, but met with heads of state, and those heads of states looked to LaRouche for ideas under conditions of crisis. Now, I have a question for you. If I were to ask you, and I am, how many heads of state, presidents, ex-presidents, prime ministers, ex-presidents, would you guess that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche and a couple of his top aides met with over the course of his 40 years of political organizing internationally? What would your guess be? I don't know if we could turn to the audience to actually get a little feedback here on this. I'm interested to know what people really think. Don't say 600, what do you actually think?
20. 15.
Okay, one person said 20. 20,000? I don't think so. There aren't that many. Could you name any? You could probably name Indira Gandhi, and you could probably name Lopez Portillo because we've talked about a lot. You might recall that Lynn also had a fairly interesting discussion with Ronald Reagan before Reagan was president in a debate that they had in New Hampshire. So that would be 3. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, this is incomplete. I want you to know this is incomplete. For example, it does not have any of the people in Africa, and I know there were people in Africa. I have to fill this out further, but this is sort of a start. In Argentina, Lyndon LaRouche met with Raul Alfonsín. In Brazil, he didn't, but top representatives of his met with ex-president João Figueiredo in Brazil. In Cambodia, Gail Billington met with Hun Sen. Dominican Republic, Joaquim Balaguer, I met with him. Guatemala, Cerezo. India, we've talked about. Israel, Lynn met with Abba Eban. Lebanon, Michel Aoun, Jacques Cheminade. Malaysia, Mahathir, et cetera, et cetera. You get an idea here. Turkey, Ozal, Lynn and Helga met with Ozal, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, just think about this for a second. Why would these people meet with somebody who wasn't a senator? I mean, Lynn was emphatically not a senator. Why would they do it? Well, the media would argue in some cases, and they did this in Mexico, it's because they didn't really know who they were meeting with. They were duped. They were told something different. They thought he was really somebody else, and so on and so forth, which is all nonsense. They were meeting with him because he and his youth movements at the time even though some of us were a little older by then, but we were his youth movement, and we are his youth movement, were presenting ideas that they knew they vitally needed as an alternative under conditions of a breakdown collapse, which was threatening the existence of their nations. And that's why they met, not because they were prepared to take action. Only 2 or 3 out of these were prepared to take action and did take action based on Lynn's ideas. Lopez Portillo was one, Gandhi was another, Reagan was another with the SDI. But they met because ideas are the most powerful moving force of history, whether they knew it or not. And that's why we have to organize the youth movement, and we are organizing a youth movement. That's why the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, to exonerate his ideas so that they can be the center of ongoing political discourse in the United States and internationally, is the centerpiece of the entire strategic situation. And it is that, and only that, which gives grounds for optimism under conditions in which the enemy, facing a breakdown crisis and the possible destruction of his entire system, is making an effort to organize a mass fascist movement. And it's probably safe to say that if we don't do our job, they have a very good chance of succeeding by default. That's why, in the immediate period, we are publishing a pamphlet for distribution starting immediately, meaning this weekend and Monday, at the United Nations and elsewhere, exposing this green fascist movement and presenting the alternative in terms of actual science. We are organizing an event on October 5th on the true space science based on LaRouche's ideas, which Dennis Speed can tell you a whole lot more about in the discussion period. And we are also organizing a cadre school for youth, the people who are coming around, who are organizing with us, who are beginning to get familiar with ideas, so that they can actually learn some science, so that their pessimism can't simply be intuitive, which is natural, but actually based on such profound scientific ideas that they're prepared for everything. Prepared, if necessary, to lose their friends, prepared, if necessary, to be considered a black sheep. That's always a good thing in this society. Prepared to go to jail if necessary, prepared like Joan of Arc to give up your life if it has to be. And that is the basis on which we are moving forward in this period. Those are the immediate direct things we intend to do. And they all have, I was going to say they have one common denominator. They have 2. One common denominator is LaRouche, the exoneration of LaRouche and his ideas. The other common denominator is money. Or better said, the lack of money. We don't have the resources yet to do this, but we have to do it. Therefore, we will do it. So the only question is, you who are listening, participating, organizing with us, helping us to make sure that the funds are available. Would you not have done that had you known what the stakes were in Nazi Germany in the early 1930s? You would have, or else you wouldn't be listening to this discussion. What we're facing today is actually more serious and more dangerous in that situation because it's global. Therefore, come on board. The fight's a lot of fun. And please help us as much as you can financially. Thank you very much.
Good. Okay, so what we're going to do is go to questions here. I want to have that picture of Lynn. Can you put that up? We're going to have a little dialogue session quickly here with Lynn. All right, so here's the dialogue. Prince Philip said, and here's how I want you to do it. Take the picture down. And when I tell you to put it back up, put it back up. Prince Philip said 96 months and the world would end in 2009. That meant the year 2017, and we are still here. Can we see the picture? Okay, take it down. Today, the New York Post headline, after the massive rallies that happened in New York City. Matter of fact, not just the headlines, the full page of the New York Post is an obituary. It's an obituary for Bill de Blasio and his presidential campaign. Let me explain. Bill de Blasio, for people who don't know who are watching this, is the mayor of New York City, because you might not know it since he never does anything. And he ran a presidential campaign that you might have heard of because you might have seen him on the stage with the various people who were also running. And his campaign existed from May 15th until September 20th. The other reason you might not have heard of him is because he's the one that called for the public schools to let everybody go out to the demonstration. So, and then when the demonstration came downtown to City Hall, he greeted the demonstrators. So here's what the obituary says. It says, Bill de Blasio's presidential campaign, May 15th, 2019, September 20th, 2019. Dead of ego-induced psychosis. Neighbors said the body had been in rigor mortis for some time. It died doing what it loved best, being as far away from New York City as possible. It was surrounded in the end by its friends, MSNBC hosts. It's in a better place now, a Park Slope gym. Whether it was in the empty churches of South Carolina, the sun-kissed empty deserts of Nevada, or begging someone, anyone, to talk to de Blasio at the Iowa State Fair, the campaign always gave 100% and always polled at 1%. Can't was never part of its vocabulary, and neither was won't, please stop, or this is a dumb idea. The campaign is survived by hotel industry officials who expect favors from City Hall and 8 million suffering New Yorkers. You see, the people of the United States are not that concerned about whether or not their lives are going to end in 12 years. They're concerned about whether or not they can pay the rent in the next 12 days. And this is an important thing to understand, because the people that called this little show yesterday, put the picture back up, don't understand what Lyndon LaRouche represented. What he represented is what you see in the picture. And that's the idea of what our movement is all about. There was an Indian accountant. This was, I guess, back in 2015, I think, when Narendra Modi first came, I think, to New York. After the rally, this big rally had 17,000 people. And the accountant was standing outside and was baffled because he had heard Prime Minister Modi, who had just been elected, say that the primary resource of India were its 600 million young people. And he said, I never thought that. I always thought if you had more young people, and you had more people, it's a burden to the economy. But he's saying that's the major economic asset we have. You look at that picture. That's the point. So, for example, if we say, well, we can't raise the money we need to stop what we recognize to be an attempt to create the pretext for a form of terrorism that we're familiar with from 9/11. You see, people are thinking when we say fascist movement about a whole bunch of people in uniforms walking down the street. But I will venture to say that the major perpetrators of this movement may never be seen by you. And they will have nothing to do with the people in the street. They will be the people who contract, whether that be by the form of serial mass killings through schools or some other way, to induce a certain kind of terror in the United States. After all, if high school students are so extraordinarily upset about the extraordinary irresponsibility of science teachers that, let's say, claim that there is no such thing as global warming that's threatening the human race, that they shoot them, who can blame them? After all, the world's going to boil over. See, so if you don't think that this is an active factor right now on every street corner of America, you just haven't been paying attention. It just isn't going to look like you think it's going to look. Doesn't have to be a mass movement. It simply has to be plausible, because you're dealing with people who are being greenwashed. So once you've got people who are in a greenwashed state, you do things that they find plausible. As long as that works, you're fine. Our job is to go, as we did with Obama and the mustache, to go directly after this in the most direct way we can. And basically, truth has to knock out the brains of falsehood. So what it means that we're going to have to assemble, whatever we happen to have thought our time frame was going to be, a small contingent, maybe larger, of young people who are going to have to go challenge this, not necessarily in every campus of America, but on the street corners of America and with the people of America. Because what has to happen is that people have to stand up for reason. Because to stand up for reason is the only thing that proves that you're actually free. Otherwise, you're just dealing with a nation of slaves. And I'm not saying that about the United States as such. I'm saying that's true in any nation. That's true in any place. When you're confronted with this kind of situation, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, for example, in Nazi Germany in 1933 at the age of 27, you go on the radio and you denounce Hitler, which is what he did. And was he killed? Not then. And he continued to do these things until 1935. He came to America for a period of time. He was over at Union Theological Seminary. Went back. And then in 39, when things got very, very hairy, some friends of his told him to leave again. And he came to New York City. I think he was here for about 5 or 6 days. And he said, this is the wrong place for me. I have to go back. And he became one of the 5 or 6 leading members of the resistance at that time, well, of the people who did the bomb plot against Hitler. He was a committed pacifist, by the way. He remained a committed pacifist. But he was one of the 5 people who were the center for the bomb plot against Adolf Hitler. You work that out in your mind. It's completely worked out in mine. If you find that to be a contradiction, work it out in your mind. Because the issue involved is the idea of man. What is mankind? What is God that man be in his image, as Lyndon LaRouche once said. So I think this is where we find ourselves, and I think it's important to, in whatever discussion we have a limited time. A lot of our people are out deploying, and where some of us have to do some things to address what Dennis said at the end. But we're prepared to take a few questions now. So if anybody has anything, either questions or comments, just go to the microphone, and we'll take that now. Can you just help with the microphone?
I just want to say, because I heard that quotation by Moti before, that his youth or the young people who are born are actually an asset to the nation. I've heard that, him say that or read it somewhere. And I also wonder what is happening to maybe we call it the industrial nations, where they're not having as many children, or youths are not performing in a proper economic manner. Or what I'm trying to express is sometimes you hear the quotation, yes, some are having more children, but it's the wrong type who's having it. In other words, the projection is the middle class, but the one who has potential to teach their children. So my issue now is, are we going to increase our population through everybody wanting more children? It seems to be like everyone's saying, oh, I can't have more children because it's too expensive.
Yeah, Dennis, why don't you take that question?
Okay, sure. Yeah, that part about, oh, the wrong kind of people are having the children is fairly typical of the racist outlook, the fascist outlook of these people. And yes, one of the best incentives to encourage people to accept a Malthusian, a zero population growth approach, is to simply make it economically impossible for them to have children. I mean, that's of course very effective as a means of accomplishing that result, to make it impossible for people to marry, make families, and so on and so forth. And I'll come to what I think is the heart of the question you're asking. I want to just mention that I also, well before Modi, had heard many, many years ago, someone was commenting, saying, well, wait a minute, there's something wrong with the outlook that says that when you have another cow, that's good and that's wealth, but if you have another child, that's bad and it's a loss. So just think about that for a minute. It is the same point that Modi is making, but this has been around. I heard that like 30, 40 years ago, whenever it was. But because this outlook, the same argument has been around. Their form of apocalypse that they're predicting to induce fear has varied. You know, some say the world will end in fire, some say by ice. But the idea that it's bad to have kids, but good to have more physical possessions, even like a cow. What is your concept of economy? What is your concept of man underlying this thing? Now, yes, we definitely should have more people. We need more people. We require an increase in the population, not just because it's good to have more creative people and it's not because it's morally correct and so on. It is all of that, but because if we are going to actually move forward in mankind's trajectory into the solar system and from there into the galaxy and onward to the stars, to get to know the universe and to get to know how we know things in a different way, which is what relativistic travel actually poses. It's not just going to a new place or learning new things about the new neighborhood. It's the very way that your mind functions has to shift to know what you're knowing. And Einstein understood that point very, very well. But to be able to do all of that, it requires a level of development of a qualified labor force that will in turn require much longer education period. People will enter the labor force much later. I mean, in a very poor country, people enter the labor force, kids, when they're 8, 10, 11 years old, even younger in some cases. Or in the United States, many cases you'd be after, you know, when you're 17 or 18. If you're lucky to go to college a little bit, okay, a little bit later. But we're actually going to require, as a greater form of generalization of the way we function, levels of education and specialization and knowledge of science in all of its areas that's going to require in-depth understanding of a sort that's going to require a longer education, greater education. So if you think of this in terms of LaRouche's bar diagrams, that affects your working age population in one way. It's true people will also be living longer, and I think should be working longer so long as it's the right kind of work, not just by not retiring because you can't afford not to. That's a different matter. But the level of division of labor that's required as technology progresses in turn gets greater and greater. I mean, you can say and look at just the current industrial economy today in the world, sort of the existing decent level. That cannot function unless you have an average potential population density of about 50 people per square kilometer. Now, take a look at it. Where do you have that? And the reason for that is, again, this division of labor, which in turn is a function of your advancing technological level. So yes, the world does need more people. We need more people. We need more people of a certain quality, a certain characteristic, and so on and so forth. The reason that the contrary view is being pushed is the same reason it has always been pushed throughout history. This Malthusian outlook, this fascist pessimistic outlook, did not begin with Paul Ehrlich. It didn't begin with Bertrand Russell. It didn't begin with Prince Charles. This goes way back. It goes back to Malthus, and it goes back way before that. It's the oligarchical view that man is a beast, that man is not a being of reason. And therefore, anything that threatens the system which is based on that concept of man has to be eliminated and wiped out. What's the problem that we have now? The problem that we have is that the people who run the media, who run most of the political parties, who run the discussion topics today, are the people who are the owners of a cancer that adds up to $1.5 quadrillion. And they insist on maintaining their system, even if it means killing off 6 out of 7 billion people. And that is their actual stated public intention. So they have to be stopped the same way you would stop a terrorist or a criminal who's about to shoot your kids. They have to be stopped, and we have to organize society in such a fashion that we understand that, as Modi said, our biggest asset is when we have more young people. And the most fundamental idea, which is, yeah, it's great to have another cow, but it's much, much, much better to have more children and more kids and a greater population. So I hope that addresses some of the things that you were raising.
Any other questions?
How you doing, Dennis? It's Alvin. So the new paradigm in discussions with people where the truth of China's moves and initiatives and commitment to bring out over some 700 million people over some 20 years, give or take, a little more over a generation perhaps. Its commitment to space. All of these things are useful, even for those that want to try to come up with something they don't believe, but just repeat, but you know, human rights, that's one of the popular narratives that people want to use. But when I'm having conversations, the truth of what China's actually done, doing, and looking to do globally and in the United States begins to weigh them down, and they have to begin to reconsider. I read, without knowing the particulars of it, however, though, that the efforts of the lunatics and treasonous faction of British lackeys in the United States apparently recently caused an important Chinese delegation to withdraw from a number of agricultural visits in several states in the United States. So that while people need to hear from us the truth, that war that is a part of the coup continues. So I'm wondering if you could give us an actual report on what really did happen, because I'm unclear, and of course how this fits together with the, as Dennis is calling, greenwashing of our citizens, when we need to simply both look to China and join them and stop going down the rabbit hole.
Well, it's touch and go. I mean, the actual latest developments, I mean, it is touch and go. The latest developments are mildly encouraging, cautiously optimistic in terms of the US-China question in particular, which is that discussions on the trade war, on the economic policy, did continue this week with not the highest level delegations, not Liu He on the Chinese side and Lighthizer and Mnuchin on the US side, but on one level down. But the discussions went well. Both sides said that that was the case, which means that although nothing is resolved, it has not been derailed. And it's moving in the direction of an October discussion between the US and the Chinese side. So, I mean, it is hand-to-hand combat. It's day by day. It's very positive that Bolton was removed from office. I mean, it's also very positive the way that Trump did that, which was by stating that the guy was trying to get us into a war which Trump, does not intend to allow. So that's positive. But there's other things that are going on. I mean, I don't want to go through a catalog of all the good things and the bad things and somehow try to reach you don't get to an actual answer of what's going on by adding up the plus and the negative columns on a daily or an hourly or a minute by minute basis. I think that's not the way to proceed on this thing, which some people do. You know, voyeurs do that. That's sort of the spectator sport. Where do we stand? What's the score this quarter? But that's not what we are. We're participants in this thing. And what I mean by that is put yourself in the shoes. I mean, Helga has been talking about this a lot recently, and I think it's a really important concept. As an American, just like Dennis Speed was saying earlier, that we have to look at India from the standpoint of the United States, through the eyes of the United States. Also true at the same time, and it's the same approach, is you have to look at the United States through the eyes of the world. Don't look at it from the US outwards only. Look at it also from the rest of the world looking at the United States. If you are President Xi, if you are President Putin, if you understand that Washington is not a government, but it's a battlefield, which it is, if you understand that Trump's intentions, if limited in areas especially of economics, certainly not at LaRouche's level, but generally positive in terms of what he is trying to accomplish and stated he wants to accomplish vis-a-vis Russia and China and ending wars and getting industrial development, all of those things, that Trump has not been able to do that, which is what Putin and Xi clearly understand and say publicly, that the president can't actually get his own policies through because of the opposition of the establishment. If you're sitting in one of those countries and you're looking at the situation, and even with that understanding of the United States, and you're looking at, if you're China, a color revolution being organized in Hong Kong, if you're looking at what's happening around Taiwan with arms being sold, if you're looking at Chinese scholars being expelled from the United States, visas being denied, if you're looking at economic warfare, if you're looking at Huawei, you've got to ask yourself, well, what are the forces in motion in the United States that can actually take this in the winning direction? I mean, you have to calculate that. You got to figure it out. People look to LaRouche and LaRouche's ideas as having far, far greater weight than most Americans could even imagine on a good day. Or Putin. Putin is looking at military bases moving forward right up to the borders of Russia. He's looking at ballistic missile defense systems being established that entirely threaten the strategic balance. He looks at lies being put out by the establishment and neoconservative idiots about the INF Treaty to justify the US pulling out. He's looking at all forms of spy and economic warfare and all of this stuff. And he does understand that that is not Trump, that Trump's intention is different than that. But as he has said, at a certain point, we have to calculate and judge, has this gone past the breaking point? We will not wait until the missiles start flying. We will act. And if you were the president of Russia, you would say the same thing. So their reading and evaluation on what is happening in the United States, and given that reading and their understanding of the world, their evaluation of the LaRouche movement's role and everything that we can bring to bear is the decisive strategic factor, even if they don't understand LaRouche's ideas fully, which they do not. I'm not saying that Xi Jinping and Putin do. They're pretty good, but they do not understand what LaRouche was actually talking about in the most fundamental ways. But they certainly know enough to look and see and figure. I mean, just look at the participation of various countries and their diplomatic representatives at Schiller Institute events. No more need be said. I mean, add 2 and 2 together. In this case, 2 + 2 is 4. So that, I think, is the key standpoint from which to look at the shifting battles from a day-to-day basis, is what are we doing to change the global strategic correlation of forces, which is a battle which is being waged in the realm of ideas. And that's what they're looking at. That's how we should look at it. And from an even higher level still, in judging our own day-to-day accomplishments or failure to accomplish what we must.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's see.
Is this all right? That's fine? Okay. Hi, Dennis. It's Mike Lepic here. And I just thought I wanted to plug the journal that you're a co-editor of.
He's not exactly.
He's not exactly? All right. Pseudo co-editor. No. But let me just preface with a joke that on Prince Philip reminded me of a joke. I got into the doctor's office and I said, well, doctor, how am I doing? He said, God, I got some bad news. I mean, I think you got 6 months to live. And I said, oh, geez, and I can't pay the bill. He said, all right, I'll give you a year. Anyhow, 1971, August 15th, the whole Bretton Woods system collapsed, and Lynn ended up in this debate in Queens. And one of the things he said there, you know, has resonated since I heard about it, which is back in the 70s, to this very day, where he said, this was one of the central points, I think, of his whole presentation in the debate, was that your politics reflect your economics, all right? And the thing about fascism is and the idea of fascism is that you're committed to reducing the conditions of life of the citizen under your domain, all right? And that necessitates fascism, right? You have to have an authoritarian system to impose upon a population, because as many monkeys and donkeys as you may have among your population, there's still that human potential, and a certain potential element is going to revolt. So you have to have a fascist system to do that. So one of the things that we have done with this journal over the last period has been reprinting the articles that Lynn has written over the years, and I'm astounded how much better they are now than when they first came out, because I was not ready to understand what he was actually saying. Now, this particular issue, which I think everybody in the room has, I'm not downplaying anything in here, but I am uplifting the last 3 articles, right? It's Bruce Director, and then it's a transcript of a dialogue between Bruce and Megan Beats, and then the last is like the stretto of the 3. Because what they go through is, what did Lyndon LaRouche do? Why is he the key figure of the modern era of world history? And the answer is, he made a fundamental breakthrough at the frontiers of Western civilization, the science of Western civilization, all right? And your statement just now that, you know, they all know that he did something. And like in the case of Putin, Xi Jinping, these guys know he did something. And that gives him an authority which is going to radiate for eternity. And the thing that I think is so important, because your point that we're not base building, right? It's from the top down. So our method is to give people their creativity. Give them back the power of humanity, which is to make immortal breakthroughs for the development of the human species. Lynn did it, and he's laid it out since the early 50s, over and over and over again. Here's what I did, all right? You do it. Let your grandchildren do it. The exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche brings science back to authority in the United States. The powers in the United States have no authority unless they listen to the advanced thinkers that we have. Reagan did it, and he changed world history, right? Trump must do it, and through him, the American people at large. Let's bring knowledge back into play. We don't need mass-based forces like this bullshit we just had over the last couple of days. We need leaders, right? People who are human. Bring them back their humanity. Read the EIR. That's my love.
Yeah, I'll definitely second that, and I do want to say that I am associated with EIR magazine, and proudly so. So I think I'm the Ibero-American editor last time I looked. But no, what you mentioned, I want to say one thing, and Daniel, get ready because this is coming your way. That debate that you just referred to of Lyndon LaRouche with Abba Lerner at Queens College in 1971, I was actually there. I was 21 years old at the time, and you know, I've been around the LaRouche movement for a bit, and here was Lyndon LaRouche debating one of the most famous economists in the United States, and LaRouche said, "What you are proposing is fascism." He called it by its name. As he used to say, if it's a glass of milk, call it a glass of milk. And he was saying that, and I was a young follower of LaRouche's, and I was kind of nervous, and now here he goes again, and what's going to happen next? And the next thing that happened is that Abba Lerner said, well, the problem is if people had shocked the central bankers' policies, then Adolf Hitler would not have been necessary. And I remember sort of a wave coming over me and saying, oh my God. He just said it. And I think that was an overall political phenomenon. And that, you know, was deeply impressive to me at the age of 21. So the question, Daniel, is what are we doing on campuses in that vein, around that? What kind of reactions are we getting? What are people thinking? What are they saying? Not just the good news, the bad news, you know, just more of a sense. I think that would be very useful for me and others to hear more about.
Well, Daniel's not here. He went back to the office because he's involved in trying to raise some of that money we need. That's why he let off. But maybe I'll have somebody who's here say something. Why don't you take that?
Hi, it's Lissy. I would say that the responses have actually been quite open, and it's my impression that the responses here in the US have been more open than in Europe. I think that people here do not seem so dedicated to Greta and the idea that they should start trying to not exist. And when you start joking with people and just say, well, do you like people? We're looking for people who like people today, because the world needs more people. We don't need less. And people laugh, and they like the idea that what we're saying is that the fundamental problem is this concept that man is an animal, that you can allow man to be treated as an animal. And when we bring up this concept of the Moon-Mars mission as a statement of the human beings being something special, and they like it. They like. I had one kid the other day. He was saying, everybody just wants to make money, and what's fun is to go out, to clubs. That's fun. Go to clubs, make money, blah blah blah. This was in the Bronx, and I said, well, that's not fun. You don't know what fun is. And he said, well, what's fun? What do you think is having fun? Then I said, well, what's having fun is making a discovery that nobody else ever made before. And then he was like, oh, that's cool. that's what he said. So I think that the response is pretty open. When we go out with big ideas, these young people are very, very intrigued. So I think we just have to go more out there and with very paradoxical ideas. Yeah, that's my idea.
Good. Good. I just want to add a couple things on that. Not on the particulars, but that's why I referenced this de Blasio character, because that's what people are being presented with as presidential candidates. Now, they don't think that these people are presidential candidates. They just think they're as ridiculous as they are. The fact that people can put a show on and you would have an audience, I mean, this guy can't get an audience unless he manufactures it by telling kids to skip school. You'll tend to get a large audience in New York City if you authorize kids to leave school on Friday. Then if you show up in front of it and have a video moment, right, a photo shot, you know, I guess you can say you have a mass movement. You know, that actually once happened to me in 1991 when the war happened, the Iraq war started. And without going into details, some very young kids from the UN school came over and they joined the rally we were doing out there. We had maybe 80 or 90 people finally. When they came over, they were part of it. And they took a bunch of our signs, which we gave them, and they went down a few blocks to what was a larger rally. And because of their enthusiasm, what they were able to do, I had said this to them, but I didn't think they could do it. I said, well, you should have them come up to where we are, because we had the sound permit that day at the UN, which is on 47th, and the people down on 42nd Street didn't have the sound permit. They were out in front of Ralph Bunche. So I said, well, just take our signs and tell them to come up here. So about an hour and a half later, one of them was tugging on my coat from the back and said, Mr. Speed, can you come down to 2nd Avenue? I said, well, we were on 1st Avenue. I said, well, how come? He said, well, because we're trying to bring the people up. I said, okay, well, so I went down to the 2nd Avenue. I figured he had, I don't know, something. And as I go towards 2nd Avenue, the traffic is backing up in the street. And there's some kind of, so we had turned the corner, and there's a bunch of people out in the street marching with our signs in front, up 2nd Avenue, backing the traffic up. And what happened was that the police tried to stop this, and immediately, it being New York City, several street agitators suddenly appeared and said, lie down in the street. So we had the kids lie down in the street because horses won't trample. See, and the police had horses. So what happened is, of course, all the cameras showed up, and here I was with these kids and the cameras and the horses, and you know, you're now the center. About 5 minutes after all the pictures got taken, somebody yelled, hey, there's an opening over on 57th Street, let's go that way. And the whole crowd reversed direction. And I was there with 3 signs, and that was it. So the moral of that story is, the de Blasios and the Kamala Harrises and these other characters represent less than nothing. What we represent and what we're able to do just by inspiring a few young people who will get the idea that it's fun to discover, that their minds can discover, is that we can actually destroy the entire fabric of this movement very, very quickly. See, it's not that when we're talking about this impending rise of fascism, we're not telling you that it's not defeatable by vigorous, concerted action by a few people. It is. And that's exactly the point. That was what Lin taught us many, many decades ago, those of us who were with him at that time. And we watched him go around and do it, because that's why we were with him, because he was going around by himself. There was no security or anything else with Lin, just him and his horn-rimmed glasses and his pipe. I mean, that's the only weapon he had. And there were us, and we would go watch and see what he would do to the next professor that he was able to lure into a debate. We thought that was great. We thought that was fun. And then he said, well, I'm getting tired. Why don't you guys do this? And we looked at one another and said, well, maybe we ought to get involved in this. And that's actually how he built his movement. He had nobody. And he simply had his ideas and his courage of his convictions. And the idea that he would show us what kind of fun it was to basically burst the bubble of authority, which did not deserve to be authority. If we have any other questions, or are we at the end now? Is that what this is? Okay, there's a, oh, the CO2 report, okay. Yeah, I'll just put, yeah, this is just, so people know, this report is the one that we are now trying to get out, for which we're raising money and so on. CO2 reduction is a mass murder policy designed by Wall Street and the City of London. We have, and you'll be hearing about this by email and other means. And I think that's all I'll say about it right now. There's a letter of transmittal that we've also put out, which I think will be received by people in an email very shortly. So if there are no other questions, I think we're going to probably end it now because many of us have a good deal of work to do. And Dennis, I want to thank you for being with us today and doing that presentation. And on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. Thank you to the people that are watching, and we'll see you next week.